Welcome to Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. I'm your host, Levi Brackman. This week, I had a wonderful conversation with JJ Kimche. JJ is a PhD candidate at Harvard University, where he specialized in the intersection between modern European philosophy and post-Enlightenment Jewish thought. One of the reasons I really enjoyed this conversation is because JJ is a guy who has just tremendous amount of knowledge about Judaism and Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy, specifically modern Jewish philosophy, but also all the way going back till temple times and the Talmud and Jewish thought from the Middle Ages, etc. And we got into some really meaty issues in Jewish ideas and Jewish thought, all the way from whether the Torah was written by God and what should be the belief with regard to that, biblical criticism, conversations about heresy and people like Louis Jacobs, the thought of Jonathan Sacks, as well as Chassidut, and we even discussed free will. So it was really a wide-ranging conversation. I really enjoyed it. We could have gone on for much longer. I really think that you are going to enjoy it as much as I did. This is a person who is really worthwhile listening to and talking to. And he also has his own podcast called The Podcast of Jewish Ideas, and I suggest you go and check that out as well. As always, I start off asking my guests on the podcast to describe themselves in their own terms, and this is how we started the conversation and how JJ describes himself.
By day, I am an aspiring academic. I'm a PhD student in Jewish intellectual history at Harvard University. And I do all the other things that graduate students generally try to do to hold body and soul together. So I teach, I write, I do all sorts of other small jobs adjacent to my academic ambitions. My main area of academic interest is the modern period. And when historians say modern, they mean something like 18th, 19th century onwards. So that for me is the most fascinating and really fertile period of Jewish history that there is, Jewish intellectual history there is. The ideas and the arguments that were going on there were extraordinary and multifaceted and interesting in a very wide variety of ways. And the truth is that is something that keeps me going. Like many academics, I have a great problem separating business from pleasure. In other words, the books that I tend to read towards my PhD and towards my area of interest, also the sorts of books that I read just on Shabbos or whenever I have free time. And it's the sort of area of interest where the work never really stops, but also the fun never really stops, which is why I chose it as a career and hope to pursue it, because
it wasn't for the money then.
No, that would be extremely foolhardy. And neither myself nor my long-suffering wife imagined that academia would lead to a lot of money. What I would say as well is, of course, that being a Jew and a religious Jew in an academic context, that does throw up a series of, I would say, tensions, some of them creative tensions, some of them burdensome tensions between my, let's say, religious life and religious personality and what I do for a living. Those are, of course, somewhat ameliorated by the fact that I do the modern period and not, let's say, the biblical period or the rabbinic period, which throws up many more questions. However, and this is perhaps the last thing I would say on this particular topic, is that any competent Jewish studies aspiring academic or aspiring scholar has to be competent in a wide range of things, right? In other words, if I'm doing 18th, 19th century Jewish studies, obviously I have to have a good grasp of medieval Jewish philosophy, and obviously I have to have a good grasp of halachic history, and obviously I have to have a good grasp of rabbinic texts, and obviously I have to have a good grasp of the Bible and that history there, because all of that comes into play throughout the period that I'm talking about. And therefore the debates that I had and that I read and the books that I read necessitate a solid background in a wide variety of things. And the truth is that this is something that is not peculiar to academics, meaning any Jew who wishes to be literate or to be widely read or deeply thoughtful within his or her own tradition would have to know a lot about a lot, constantly reading, constantly educating themselves in a wide variety of issues, in a wide variety of eras and texts and philosophical debates and figures, etc. Which is why podcasts like yours are useful, are important, and like mine, of course, as well.
And we should mention your podcast, because the other one of the things which you do as part of your and how I came across you is I was searching for Jewish podcasts, and I was incredibly excited to find yours. So, besides being a PhD student, you're also disseminating knowledge out there. To talk a little bit about your podcast and how people can find it.
So my podcast is a podcast about Jewish ideas, and I very creatively titled it The Podcast of Jewish Ideas. It's yes, I know, 10 points for creativity there. It's part of an educational outfit called Torah in Motion. And essentially what it is, it's a very simple idea, which is that I've noticed in my travels through academia that there are many excellent scholars out there who work on really interesting material all over the field of Jewish studies, be it intellectual history, social history, economic history, whatever it is. And the problem is that most of their books are generally not read by the public. Most of their fascinating ideas aren't discussed or aren't available, accessible to the public generally, those who don't read specialized academic books. And I thought this is a great pity. And I think many of these academics as well, some of them do cut the sort of stereotypical figure of someone cloistered in their library and incommunicative and generally not a very good teacher. But actually, my travels in academic fields have shown this is not the case. Many academics are actually very talented communicators and very talented pedagogists. And it's a great pity that almost nobody outside the university departments and their 5 colleagues in their specific subfields ever heard of them. So what I decided to do is to simply have conversations, to find serious scholars, academic scholars, and I'm happy to add also rabbinic scholars and others in their field and say, you're an expert on 16th century Jewish intellectual history or halakhic history, whatever it is. Come, let's sit down and talk for an hour about it. Tell me about some of the ideas, answer some questions for me. And honestly, so far, it's been great.
Yeah, and I've really enjoyed them. And one of the things one can see is that you have, as you mentioned, a lot of knowledge in almost all of these subjects. So you bring a very knowledgeable perspective to the conversation, which makes it very interesting to listen to, because it's not just someone asking questions, but it's actually a dialogue, which I find really enjoyable.
That's very kind of you, and I want to correct you on that, which is that I have a generalist's knowledge on a lot of these things, meaning that I've made it my business. I think every literate Jew should make it their business to read at least surface level on the length and breadth of Jewish history and Jewish texts and Jewish ideas, such that when I meet a scholar, I at least know what questions to ask.
Okay, there we go.
And then they could provide the answers, because of course they are serious experts in those fields, and that's important.
So I want to jump off into this conversation with, I'm from London, and you're from London. There were a few characters who loomed very large in the psyche of Anglo Jewry. One of them was Jonathan Sachs Zatzal. And then there's this other character who could have been chief rabbi, and his name is Louis Jacobs.
Yes.
And you wrote an article, which was really a review of a book about Louis Jacobs. And so for those who don't know who Louis Jacobs is, can you just, because I think it's going to be really interesting to talk about this and then jump on from the dance.
Yes, absolutely. Louis Jacobs was the central character of an affair that has become known to posterity as the Jacobs Affair, which rocked Anglo Jewry and really Jewry as a whole about the mid-60s, I think 1963, 1964. And it was as follows. So Louis Jacobs was a precocious and brilliant Talmid Chacham. He really, if you read any of his books, his knowledge and talent at conveying that knowledge is really something extraordinary. He really did have an enormous depth of understanding in Jewish texts and just general rabbinic writings across the entirety of Jewish history. And he was essentially, he was a teacher at what was then called Jews College, is now called the London School of Jewish Studies. And he was a senior tutor then. He was essentially tipped to become the next principal of Jews College. And that would have been a stepping stone, people say, to the chief rabbinate, because he was England's young, dynamic, brilliant, up-and-coming rabbi who really knew everything, was a very clear and clever communicator. However, in the late 50s, he wrote a book called We Have Reason to Believe. And this book was essentially a consideration of various challenges or difficulties with traditional Jewish faith. And certain chapters in that book demonstrated that Louis Jacobs had really fallen in love, I think it's fair to say, with academic Bible studies, with the kind of academic scholarship going on in departments of biblical studies throughout universities around the world, specifically biblical criticism and specifically the documentary hypothesis. And for those listeners who don't know what I'm talking about, it is the theory that, again, is regnant in academic departments across the world, which is that the Chumash that we have today isn't written by one hand in one style by Moshe Rabbeinu, 13th, 14th century before the Common Era. Rather, we're talking about it's composed instead of a series of 4 or 5 documents put together by a much later editor, probably around the time of the first Galut, or around the time of the 6th century BCE. And that's why you have all the apparent contradictions and apparent repetitions and redundancies that you see throughout the Chumash. And that is basically the theory that Louis Jacobs was faced with, and scholars, Jews today, even faced with. But Louis Jacobs seems to have bought deeply into this theory and seems to have really seen it not so much as a theory, but as a settled fact, as a science. And basically, he propounded the position in that book that this is something that we have to accept, and religious Jews have to accept, that in fact, we're talking about not one document that was handed to one person at one time, but rather several documents that have been sewn together over time. And he proposed a kind of a synthesis which says you can say that all of these documents were divinely inspired and that God cooperated with various people throughout the generations, throughout the centuries, to eventually have the Chumash as we have it today. And so Louis Jacobs didn't so much deny Torah min hashamayim as he denied Torah misinai. In other words, he denied it as given to Moses in one shot and as given, and therefore, and then subsequently passed down to the Jewish people. So he writes this in his book, We've Reason to Believe, and starts teaching this in Jews College. And it seems to me that he rather naively believed that the Orthodox rabbinate of his time would be okay with this, would see the light, would allow for this kind of synthesis between academic theories and the age-old, at least to the medieval period, but also back to the rabbinic period, belief of Torah min hashamayim, of Torah Moshe Sinai, of every single word and every single letter in the Chumash, as described by Maimonides, being dictated from God to Moses. And he believed that the rabbis could accept his new theories, and he was bitterly disappointed. Almost uniformly, Orthodox rabbinate in England turned on him, specifically the chief rabbi, Israel Brody, at the time, essentially vetoed his appointment to the principal of Jews College, vetoed his appointment to any rabbinic position within the United Synagogue, that is the Orthodox umbrella organization of synagogues in England. And essentially, he had to go and, wouldn't say found, but be the central figure of the Masorti movement, which is essentially a non-Orthodox movement among Anglo Jewry. But this always sat very ill for him. He really believed that he was Orthodox. He really believed that he was a faithful and true Jew till his dying day. And in a way, his story is a bit of a tragic story, because he didn't realize quite how irreconcilable his ideas would be with mainstream Orthodoxy within England and around the world at the time.
Thank you. That's a really good summary of the story. But in your review of this book, you argue that, in fact, it is incompatible for a person to believe in the documentary hypothesis as being the way the Torah came together and be Orthodox.
Let me sharpen what you say, because that's not quite what I said. It's very close. Okay. Let me sharpen it. It is, what I argued was that Jacobs could not and should not, and also the reason why I wrote this in the book review is because the author of the book, Harry Friedman, was also indignant on behalf of his subject. This is always a dangerous thing for a biographer to do, which is get too invested in a subject. He's very, until he has a kind of worshipful view of Jacobs, and he and Jacobs as well were clearly shocked and disappointed that the Orthodox rabbis couldn't get in line. And I simply pointed out that is far too much to expect from the Orthodox rabbinate at the time. Now, the truth is that the way that Jacobs was proposing his view, it is extremely difficult to see, not so much religiously, but logically, how they can be logically compatible, logically be made to be synthesized. The idea of, again, a kind of documentary hypothesis and the age-old Jewish belief that Torah was given as it stands to Moses by God. And therefore, Louis Jacobs and his biographers and his fans shouldn't be surprised at all about the Orthodox response to it. Now, the truth is that in the century and a half, almost 2 centuries since biblical criticism became widespread within, let's say, academia in Europe, specifically Germany, and then spread to England and Denmark and other places as well. In that time, there have been numerous attempts by Jews to try and square the circle, to try and create a bridge that crosses it. Many of them very creative, some of them even to a certain degree intellectually satisfactory, although I think ultimately not. But nonetheless, that wasn't quite what Jacobs was doing. Jacobs was quite radical in his acceptance of the documentary hypothesis, and that cannot be, it just never can and never will be accepted by the Orthodox authorities unless we see some sort of intellectual shift within Orthodoxy that we haven't seen in 2,000 years.
So you do have modern day incarnations of this, like the Terrorcom, and we have Zev Farber was one of the people I interviewed for the podcast, who is one of the editors of the Terrorcom. And if you listen to them, your argument seems to be a little bit diametrically opposed to their argument, which is your argument is don't expect, and I'm putting words in your mouth, and just tell me if I'm right or wrong here, but you're basically saying is like, if you want to accept the documentary hypothesis, that's fine. But now don't claim you're Orthodox. Is that in other words what you're saying?
I don't claim you're Orthodox in the sense that Orthodoxy has developed and stands today as it is. In other words, someone could come along, and I'm half receptive to this argument, could come along and say, you know what, Orthodoxy should not sign up to again, I just want to go back into intellectual Jewish history just a tiny bit, which is that this formulation that we have, that every single word and every single letter of the Torah must be by God, dictated by God to Moses, that extreme formulation is a Maimonidean formulation. The very first one to formulate it that precisely is Rambam. In his introduction, he wrote this in very young years of his life, probably in his early 20s. And that particular kind of very extreme formulation, that has caught on, although not without argumentation, has caught on generally within Orthodox circles, at least certainly from about the 15th, 16th century onwards, and Mark Shapiro and others have written extensively on this, exactly the history of when Maimonides' 13 principles of faith have been caught on and when they haven't. Yeah. But it seems to me today, I'm just saying, as a sociological and intellectual reality, that is what Orthodox Jews and certainly Orthodox rabbis sign up to today. And you could argue, maybe they shouldn't, you could argue that the Maimonidean view should be replaced, let's say, maybe by the view of Ibn Ezra, who seems at least to be open to the possibility of some verses being added by later prophets or some other thinkers. And again, you could make the argument that Orthodoxy should have gone a different direction and maybe could in the future go a different direction. However, what I was saying is the way that Orthodoxy has taken on the idea, adopted the idea of Torah min Shamayim, and the way that they have, again, I say they as though I'm not part of it, of course I am, but the way the Orthodox Jews in general have conceived of this, there is no way to reconcile this with a hard notion of documentary hypothesis as Jacobs adopted it.
Yeah. So what's interesting, the opposing view, just to state here, is that, one second, by accepting the Maimonidean view here, you're basically now having a who's in, who's out argument rather than a religious argument, right? It's more, and something that Zev Faber, for example, will reject. He'll say, who are you to tell me who's in, who's out? But the other argument today is, what's wrong? Just say I'm not part of these people. Like, why not? In other words, I've come to a conclusion which is different than these people, and therefore I'm no longer part of those people, and therefore I'm no longer Orthodox. I'm a sorority or something else.
Exactly. The truth is, I'm very puzzled by an argument like that. Who are you to say? Okay. For the simple reason that every group on earth, every ideological grouping or every grouping around, let's say, a political issue has its definitions and has its boundaries. Let me tell you, a vegetarian knows exactly who's a vegetarian and who's not. In other words, if I say, I would like to be a vegetarian, but I actually have a hamburger every night for dinner, a vegetarian could turn around to me and say, listen, you might be a lovely person. I might like you. I want to hang out with you. I want to be your friend. You're not a vegetarian because you eat meat, right? It shouldn't be very complicated. Now, it's funny because in today's world, the notion of gatekeeping, the notion of setting very rigid boundaries around groups has come to be seen as suspect, as something immoral, unethical, something that is opposed to inclusivity and diversity and a welcoming posture. And the truth is that I don't believe this to be the case. Those two aren't mutually exclusive, because a group should at least have quite set and certain boundaries to say who they are, but nonetheless can adopt a very open attitude. And of course, the best example of this, pursuant to what we were discussing before we started recording the show, is Chabad, right? Chabad Jews are under no illusion as to what Judaism demands of belief, right? They are very Maimonidean in that sense and accept the 13 principles as absolute, etched in stone, as though it was given by God to Moses. Let's say, for argument's sake, it gets more complicated and fuzzy around the edges, but let's just say, for the argument's sake. However, they're still very open and very inclusive and positive, and generally, and they do extraordinary work in many ways, despite the various flaws that I don't need to tell you, and anyone can find out for themselves. So
no one or no group is perfect.
Precisely, far from it. Apart from my group that I happen to belong to, obviously. That's the natural response, right? So yes. So what I'm saying is that the accusation of who are you to set boundaries is just an odd one. Every ideological group who wish to be.
It's only not odd because these are people who feel very deeply connected to the traditions, to the mitzvot, to the Torah itself, in almost every single other way, except for what they're saying is, and this is part of an interesting question, on what they're saying is, hey, I'm just have my eyes open to reality that exists out there. Sure. You know, the fact that Einstein came with the theory of relativity, the fact that there are these gravitational waves, which seems to be evidence of the Big Bang, or that there is now documentary hypothesis, which we have reams and reams of evidence for. I would like to be able to somehow not live with my head in the sand. This would be their argument.
Oh, sure.
I love Judaism. I love the Torah. And the fact that somebody else wants to have their head in the sand doesn't, in a point, what they're saying, to be Orthodox, you have to ignore all this evidence. And like you mentioned, you indicated to earlier, that in some sense if you were studying the biblical period, maybe it'd be more challenging for you. But why should that be? It seems to me, and we can go into this because it's really interesting, in the 9 days or 3 weeks where we're celebrating, I guess, is commemorating, right?
Yes.
The siege of Jerusalem,
and suffering through. Yes.
and we're reading in Daf Yomi, we're reading this story about Kochba and Bar Kochba, which was sinat chinam, or illogical hatred, which is really you're in, you're out. You can't come to my party, get out of my party, right? And so there's all this. And at that time, there were these sectarianism within Judaism, which may be, and who knows, maybe maybe one was a Sadducee and the other one was a Pharisee, and maybe that was what was going on. That's why they hate each other. Who knows? But the point is that it seems to me that there's always been sectarianism. There's always been different approaches and opinions in Judaism, and the whole idea of he's in, he's out. Maybe that's not a good thing.
Okay, so there's an awful lot. You said a lot of things, and there's a lot of possible responses to your point there. The truth is, again, there's a difference between the existence of sects and the existence of sectarianism, and the ratcheting up of differences to a boiling point. And the truth is that essentially within groups, there's subgroups and subgroups and subgroups and subgroups always, right? Yeah. And therefore, and it all depends on one's, let's say, level of focus. I'll give you an example. I recently spoke, actually a year or two ago, spoke to a lawyer who was working in the case, in some legal entanglement between the Satmar schools of Stamford Hill and the British government, the Ofsted, who were essentially trying to impose on them some kind of educational curriculum they didn't want to have. That was the sort of back and forth. And the lawyer, who's a sort of modern Orthodox Jew, helping on the Satmar side. So he sat down with the Satmar people. He said to them, "Look, okay, so obviously you're not going to have any pro-LGBTQ stuff in your school." And they said, "Absolutely not." Okay, fine. You're not going to have, let's say, photos or posters showing children of different races getting along together. No, they said it's fine. So he was desperately searching for something that he could grab on with. And they said, okay, how about you have, let's say, I don't know, a Tehillim rally or something, let's say, or a mitzvah drive with at least the local Chabad school, the local Bell school, like a different Jewish sect, just to show at least some kind of camaraderie, at least some sort of solidarity that you could show to the government officials and say, look, we are in fact a school that looks beyond the end of our own noses. And he said they turned to him and looked at him like he was absolutely mad. And you want us to sit with them? The unthinkable. And the truth is, of course, the irony is, of course, that to 99.9% of the global population and the Jewish population, I'd imagine, couldn't tell a Satmar and a Belz Chassid apart or a Belz and a Chabadnik apart at all. And this is very much part of something that Freud's called the narcissism of small differences, right? That people spend all their time and energy denigrating and worrying about those who are extremely similar to them, but ever so slightly different. In other words, minor ideological deviance is something that by human nature seems to be something that is troublesome and worthy of immense, it's just something that is supposed to worry you and must be rooted out. And you see also this true in, let's say, early Marxism and early socialism, where people would quite literally shoot each other on the streets due to a divergent interpretation of in Soviet Russia, or a slightly minutely divergent interpretation of Marx or of Lenin or of Trotsky or whatever it is. Due to ideological differences, they would kill each other. Now, the truth is that you mentioned the early sects, the sectarian movements within Second Temple Judaism, about which we have a small amount of information, not a huge amount of information. But what's interesting is that, like many other sects and like many other divisions within among Jews, among Judaism, they were somewhat ideological. They were also largely social. In other words, depending on where you lived, depending on how much money you had, depending on whether you're part of the rural or urban society, depending on whether you're part of the elite or part of the masses, depending on whether you were educated in this type of way or that type of way, that would often determine one's affiliation. And the truth is that we see that to a large degree nowadays as well, the difference between Orthodox and a conservative or Reformed Jew. So to a small, let's say, intellectual elite, the differences are ideological. But actually, to a large degree, they are, I would say, social, depending on where you live, among whom you live, what your political priorities might be, etc. And therefore, it must be slightly resisted, this notion that sects are divided only on ideological grounds, and therefore it is on the ideological grounds upon which we must focus. And the same is true in my intellectual area of focus, talking about 19th century Germany, the rise of the Reform, the rise of the conservative movements. Yes, some of it was ideological. A large part of it was driven by this immense desire on the part of the early Reformed Jews to essentially mold themselves into a type of Jew that would be palatable within 19th century civilized Europe and 19th century Germany. And it must be always remembered that the Reform movement started as a synagogue reform movement decades before it was an ideological movement, decades before it challenged notions of Torah Messina, decades before it became anything like an ideological movement. It was simply a movement of synagogues who wanted to make their synagogues look more like a upper class Hochdeutsch type of church, rather than a Hasidic shtibel where everything's a balagan and everyone's yelling at each other and it's just it looks uncivilized. I went rather far in that tangent, so much so that I couldn't remember your original question. So if you could remind me, or original points, but these are a few thoughts on sects which are worthy of note.
No, absolutely. I think to pull it back, I think that if you think about, I was brought up in London like you were, but I was brought up within a Chabad type, definitely school. My mother was very strong Chabad, etc. Mm-hmm. And when I was a kid, there was very large arguments between both Chabad and Satmar and Chabad and Rav Shach. And they were brutal.
Yes,
agreed, and the differences were minute between them. But to the people, the players involved, they were massive.
Yes.
But when you look at it, as I've grown up and I've looked at it, and I think some of the players today would look at it and say that they probably shouldn't have had those big arguments. And because we've got so much more in common than we've got to set us apart. And to get back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier before we started recording, is that you have the Moreh Nevuchim, for example, where you were mentioning that people will say, if people got questions, I'll say, hey, go study the Moreh Nevuchim. And your response to that is, that's not really that relevant today because that was good for the 12th century, but today it's not as relevant. And there needs to be a new approach to some of these questions. Talk a little bit about that, because I wonder, like, people like Louis Jacobs who are looking around and are approaching this, is the rigidity of the orthodoxy that opposed Louis Jacobs going to oppose any of that type of enterprise, so that it's just not possible?
Okay, so these are good points and good questions. So let me just bring our listeners back into the discussion we were having before, which I made the following claim. I believe it's an important claim that everyone should think about, which is that there is a problem we have within Jewish intellectual history, which is that many of the, let's say, meatier philosophical texts that were published and that have been read over the centuries, that have been relied upon to craft a quote-unquote authentic Jewish philosophy, are very medieval. They were written in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century. And they've become authoritative, things like Rabbi Yehuda Levi's Kuzari, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Emunot V'Dayot, the Chovat HaLevavot, etc., etc.
Yeah.
These texts are still today seen as the foundation of a Jewish philosophy, but more than that, they are seen as the kind of response one gives to, let's say, a bright student who says, I have philosophical problems, I have issues with Judaism, with a religion, or whatever it is, I have a certain set of fairly predictable, generally, questions. They said, okay, great, go read the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, go read, or whatever it is. The problem with that is that these books are absolutely mired in their contemporary milieu. They cannot be disentangled from the physics of the 12th century, the metaphysics of the 12th century, the ethics of the 12th century, the politics of the 12th century. These are absolutely woven into every strand of these books. And therefore, the modern student who approaches these texts trying to find answers which will satisfy him or her in today's world is likely to be at least somewhat puzzled and ultimately, I think, disappointed. Because, okay, very nice, but now Maimonides is talking about the 10 spheres of heaven, and he's talking about the sort of separated intellects which accompany each of these spheres and how each of them emanate from a previous. What's he talking about? What is this nonsense, right? Why? Because in the intervening centuries, Enlightenment philosophy is essentially uprooted and swept the rug from beneath medieval philosophy. And therefore, nobody today shares Maimonides' philosophical assumptions or scientific assumptions or metaphysical assumptions. And therefore, turning to Maimonides in the time of need is very far from useful for many people.
Not Galileo, it's also like Newton. We've had Newton, now we heard Einstein. So
sure. Yeah, but we've had so many intellectual revolutions since the 12th century that it's not. But the problem is that in the rabbinic world, this hasn't really, firstly, it hasn't really been addressed. And secondly, hasn't really filtered through, again, because their philosophical education is also reliant upon these massive texts. Now, the truth is the thing. If you're reading them like I read them, in more academic context, where I read Moreh Nevuchim as a brilliant piece of 12th century literature, which does a phenomenal job of attempting to synthesize Jewish, or let's say a biblical, Jewish biblical rabbinic worldview with the regnant neo-Aristotelian and Neoplatonic worldviews, and tries to formulate them into one coherent and cohesive worldview, that makes that book a book of genius almost beyond compare. It is an unbelievable work. However, if you approach it as a book that is supposed to solve your problems in the 21st century, the questions that you have in the 21st century, no, it'll fail.
Yeah.
So now get on to another part of what you said, which was the point that you said about people like Seth Farber and others who are trying to approach issues that people might have today. And the truth is that the kinds of issues people typically have today do need serious and sensitive tipul dealing with. It's important that works are written on the subject.
You can't just what you're saying, and just to give a little bit of the way I'm hearing it, right? Mm-hmm. So the contemporary rabbi, someone comes to them, like someone comes to the Rambam, that student, like the Rambam student, comes to the rabbi today. The rabbi, instead of acknowledging that these are real issues, and that they need, as you say, tipul need to be dealt with, they make as if they don't exist and tell them to go and read the medieval work instead.
I would say, it's just, again, to slightly tweak, because you're after all paraphrasing my position, I should be here.
I'm just telling you what I'm hearing, right?
What I say is, I don't think the rabbi ignores it. A typical rabbi would say, oh, it has been dealt with by Maimonides. It has, in other words, it's not that your questions aren't valid. It's been dealt with by others, and in fact, this is actually much more the case. I would say, even within biblical.
But biblical criticism has not been dealt with by Maimonides, for example, and neither has the Big Bang, for example. So, in other words, what you're saying is you're telling them, yes, it's been dealt with, but the truth is it hasn't. So you just don't know. I remember I met a guy called Dalman Shachta Shlomi. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
So I used to live in Colorado, so I knew
a very colorful individual. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So I knew him and spent some time with him, and I remember talking to him mentioned him Arthur Green's book, and he said to me, "You don't have the questions Arthur Green has, so you can't judge him." In other words, when you have the questions Arthur Green has, then you can talk about it. Once you know what they are, now you have a completely different empathy towards it. I think. If you don't know what they are, you can say go to the Rambam, which shows that you don't know what they are. If you're telling someone to read the Rambam.
Yes, and I want to move this to the discussion that we were talking about before, the biblical criticism, because it's actually a very common refrain, which is if someone comes to the rabbi, again, we're building this sort of stereotype of a rabbi here, which obviously rabbis come in many shapes and sizes. I'm the only male member of my family or extended family who's not a rabbi. So I actually have a bit of experience of what I speak. But even let's say, with rabbis, exactly. But even a fairly competent and well-read and a sympathetic rabbi will often say, you think you have questions on the Chumash, on the documentary hypothesis? Don't worry, Rashi and Ibn Ezra and Ramban, they knew it, they thought of it, they addressed it, they this, they that. And again, the answer is that they were aware of a very specific and very medieval inflected and medieval influenced subset of questions regarding the biblical text. And they did indeed write these extraordinary works of immense creativity and immense erudition based on the questions that came to them based within their own set of assumptions. But once you undo those assumptions, once you actually broaden the assumptions, once you no longer accept the specific presuppositions that all these thinkers had, then their works become, again, a product of their time. And I can't fault them for that. I'm not expecting Rashi and Ramban or Ibn Ezra to write a book which perfectly solves all the questions that I have,
because they didn't have all the evidence that we have through all the
evidence that we have. They don't have it's not even evidence. I tell you what, it's methodological assumption, right? So let's just say
archaeological kind of evidence today that we have, which they just weren't aware of.
That's true. Yes, archaeology, although the archaeology is okay. Actually, this is a good portal to a comment that I wanted to make earlier, which is specifically about the biblical criticism point, which is that a little bit of a part of the problem, specifically with biblical criticism, is there's no very good consensus of where Bible scholarship sits on the spectrum between art and science. Okay. And this is an argument even among biblical critics themselves, right? And they will say, okay, we're trying to date a certain biblical text, let's say Samuel or Kohelet or whatever it is, or even one of the documents in documentary hypothesis. We're trying to identify it, we're trying to date it. And they use all sorts of techniques, literary analysis, noticing of vocabulary, noticing of attitudes, etc. And the question becomes, okay, is this similar to physics and mathematics, or is this similar to literature? Analysis of Shakespeare. And the truth is that different people will, I don't want to relativize it entirely, because I think that it does sit on a certain bedrock of both hard evidence and very good argument. But at the end of the day, it does contain a fair amount of conjecture. It does contain some element of, let's say, literary analysis, where there is evidence, there's a preponderance of evidence, but it's nothing like the hard science. It's not like it is unlike archaeology, and it is unlike mathematics, and therefore some might be able to just dismiss it, right? Just say, these questions, biblical critics, is purely assumptions, it's purely conjecture, it's based on nothing, don't even bother, don't even waste your time, which I think the attitude of most Orthodox rabbis, especially those who don't particularly want to deal with it. However, those who have had a serious introduction into it, those who have really studied the text and studied the ideas, again, I'm talking about in my personal experience, there really is a lot more serious scholarship and serious questions there than many are willing to give credence to, which is a pity. Having said that, in the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a serious uptick among Orthodox scholars who are willing to take on this particular nest of questions. People like Rav Amnon Bazak, Joshua Berman, and others. Now, the truth is, I don't think they've done that good of a job. Meaning, their books are good. What can I say? But I don't think the questions are anything like answered. But nonetheless, steps in the right direction are encouraging.
So the next part of the question, which I was asking you, was if someone undertook a very serious attempt to deal with both this and all the other myriad of questions, and to create a modern day Moreh Nevuchim, how do you think the same people who respond to Louis Jacobs would respond to that attempt? Is it possible? In other words, is it possible today to truly do that in a way in which the Rambam did it with the Moreh Nevuchim, given what exists?
So I would say the following. It's certainly much more difficult, and whoever did it would have to be, again, if they wanted acceptance from, let's say, the quote unquote Haredi end of the Orthodox spectrum, they would have to be very careful how they do it and very circumspect in their language. To put it, I don't think it's impossible. It's very difficult to pull off if you're worried about them. And the classic example is the gentleman whose name you started off this podcast with, the late and greatly lamented Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, who in fact undertook some of this within his life. He actually quite scrupulously avoided some of the more difficult questions. However, when he did at one point trip a certain wire with the first edition of his book, Dignity of Difference, and he had to republish it. Actually, that almost cost him his job. He almost lost his job of...
Can I interject a story here about that?
Please.
Because I have multiple copies of the Dignity of Difference, including the first edition.
Oh,
and
that's probably worth a bit of money nowadays, actually.
I actually signed copies. He signed them for me.
Wow.
And what happened was that after they came out with this against him, and I was totally appalled, and I wanted to show him support, so I bought like 15 copies. And I came to him and I said to him, would you please sign every single one of these for me? And I know that he appreciated that. But I was appalled with what happened there, where they came out. And there was one individual whose name won't be mentioned because his name ought not to be mentioned for doing what he did at the time. But part of my podcast, which is called Truths, is a homage to that perspective that Jonathan Sachs presented in that book, The Dignity of Difference, because we can talk about truths. We don't have to constantly hold on talking about the truth when we can talk about truths. Yeah.
Yes. I fully agree. I do want to say, funnily enough, that for all my many criticisms of Sachs and his writings and his ideas, it is his book on science, The Great Partnership, is actually, as far as I know, the best modern Jewish attempt to reconcile these on the Torah science question. I think that Orthodoxy would be in a very good position if they adopted not only his recommendations of that book, but his general outlook. He got that book absolutely right. Many of the others, I don't think he did.
So do you want to give a quick overview of what that is?
Sure. So basically, Jonathan Sachs wrote this book called The Great Partnership. This was during slightly after, actually, the heyday of what was generally known as the New Atheist movement. The New Atheist movement was a movement that cropped up in the decade after 9/11, when there was this backlash against fundamentalist religion. And it was started by a man called Sam Harris, and then Richard Dawkins jumped on the bandwagon, so did Christopher Hitchens, so did Daniel Dennett and Victor Stenger and a bunch of other authors. And they produced works, none of which really arguing new arguments. There are no new arguments, as far as I know, made by any of the new atheists.
They were all the same book, by the way. They all came out with the same book. It was like,
I'd say the difference.
You read them one, you read them all.
So a little bit, yes. I'd say that Hitchens, for example, was unparalleled in his ability to catalog the evils done by organized religion throughout the centuries, which of course is extensive. The catalog is truly extensive. And but you're right. The arguments made by the new atheists were made earlier and better by Voltaire and by Bertrand Russell and by Bernard Williams, but there are many others who've tackled these at far greater and with greater eloquence as well. So in response, there was a bunch of religious responses, and one of the very few good Jewish responses to that movement. See, in the Christian world, there are a lot of excellent responses to that movement. I would recommend, for example, there's a book by John Lennox called God's Undertaker. has science buried in God? I think that was a very good one. There's an Irish theologian called Alistair McGrath, who also produced an excellent book in response. But the Jewish one that was produced was by Jonathan Sacks. And it was called The Great Partnership. It was about science and religion. And basically what Sacks advocated for in that book, and I think it's so important, I really do wish that more Jewish educators would in fact advocate this, was a kind of synthesis between science and religion, which doesn't try to domesticate science or domesticate religion. What it does do is say, give each independent discipline its own space. Okay, science answers scientific questions, and religion addresses and answers religious questions. And this is crucial. In fact, Sacks summed this up with one of his great aphorisms, and I believe I'm quoting it correctly when he says, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. Which is a classic sort of Sacksian aphorism. But essentially, what he was advocating a view that was actually advocated by Stephen Jay Gould, a Harvard paleontologist, I believe, who called it non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, the science and religion actually are generally different, and they answer different questions. Therefore, they can and must be appreciated on two different levels as two different aspects. Now, why this is so important, in my opinion, is that many sort of science and Torah books or whatever it is that are produced by Jews, especially Orthodox Jews, what they do is they try and say, you see, the Torah or the Gemara or whatever says this, and now modern science is backing this up. And that's what they claim to be as a synthesis of Torah and science. The problem with that is, firstly, it's cherry picking, it's selective, because a lot of what is written in the Talmud, a lot of what is written elsewhere is not backed up by modern science. But more than that, it lends itself open, this is what we were talking about before, to criticisms of irrelevance. In other words, in 30 or 40 years, as the science changes, so it will no longer jive or dovetail well with whichever specific example you're picking. And therefore, as long as you're trying to make these very specific types of individual partnerships between Torah and science, as time moves on, as science moves on, as our knowledge progresses, so that's going to become progressively more and more irrelevant and outdated. Whereas the Sacks approach is, look, let science do what it does. You want to find out the age of the universe? Ask a physicist, an astrophysicist. You want to find out how human beings evolved? Fantastic. Ask an evolutionary biologist. If you want to ask questions of morality, questions of human purpose, questions of justice in the world, whatever it is, these are a set of religious questions, and that's to whom you should turn, and those are the sources which are relevant there. And again, that I think was his best work, and the work whose recommendations, and again, just general methodological outlook, should be most adopted by Jews and Jewish educators today.
But the problem with that, though, is that then it becomes very difficult. People don't know, is it or isn't it, right? When you say that you have a the kulaboy, right? I can turn it up, as it says in Avot, I can take this Torah, turn around, it has everything in it. It's the answers to all things. It is the truth of all truths. It tells you everything you need to know about the universe, about the world, etc. It's all in it. It is the truth. That is very compelling. This is a book which is the key to everything. When you have this thing as well, it's more of a niche interest, right? Then it becomes a lot less compelling to a lot more people. And then the demagogue who wants to get up and say, no, it's the truth, and I'm telling you it's the truth, and trust me, it's the truth, that person is going to win. It's a difficult position to take if you want to make mass appeal.
Okay, so there are 2 points I would say in response to that. The first point is, any demagogue who gets up there and says something like that, you say, okay, next time you or a loved one are ill, I invite you to use Talmudic medicine. Don't go to a doctor. Don't seek chemotherapy. Don't seek x-rays or life thing. Use whatever prescriptions are in the Talmud. You bind a coin to your foot, or you shut yourself up with a jackal in a room, or there's various of these folk remedies in the Talmud. Please, don't use modern medicine. In fact, don't get in a car. In other words, it is painfully obvious that this isn't what is meant by that.
Yeah.
This is what is meant by that. And the truth is that's something that's crucial to bear in mind all the time, especially because once you have, again, a bright student who says, okay, I have questions about, let's say, classic thing, the age of the universe. How old is the universe? So if you are, so let's take a few different approaches. Let's classic question, age of the universe. It seems to be, at least from some traditional Jewish sources and the way we counter on official documents, 5,000, what are we up to, 783, 84? I can't remember, I've lost, whatever. Close to 6,000 years, whereas according to modern astrophysics, it's something around, I think, the 14 billion year mark. That's the sort of recent ideas. Now, the question then becomes, okay, So you can do one of two things. You can do like someone like Gerald Schroeder or other sort of these Torah science people who try and say something like
each day is a billion years.
Each day is a billion years, and you can count and think. What is the problem with that? The problem is, firstly, it sounds very unsatisfying. Secondly, it's also dependent on the science staying still, right? Because what happens if in 20 years there's another discovery that puts the age at 20 billion years or 10 billion years or whatever?
Or what if it goes back to 5,000?
Or what if it goes back to 100,000 or 100 million? Then all of that is rendered absolutely obsolete, and you feel like an idiot for having trusted that sort of science. However, if you can turn around and you say, what is the age of the universe? We don't have a strong opinion on the subject. We believe that's a scientific question. The question isn't how old it is. The question is who created it and for what purpose it's created. And it's the same with something like evolution. If the question is, was it 6 days of creation or was it evolution? And then you're presented with an entire natural history museum worth of evidence for evolution and hundreds of college courses and textbooks and professors all showing you in great detail the manner in which life on Earth evolved, and then you have to try and synthesize that with the biblical data, and it's exhausting and also very unsatisfying. To try and synthesize Genesis chapter 1 with all of that, it becomes less and less appealing. Whereas if you turn around and say, listen, the mechanism by which life was appeared on Earth, okay, who knows? We defer to the scientists. The reason for it, the agency, not the mechanism, but the agency and the purpose, that's a religious question that science can never answer. And again, that's the Saxion approach. And I think he got it absolutely right.
Yeah. And the point is that even if God was going to reveal to us exactly how he created, he wouldn't do it in one chapter like that. It would be a lot longer of a treatise than the first chapter of Genesis.
Yes. Firstly, that. And secondly, the problem a little bit is that you're reducing, I would say, the Torah to something like a manual. And now if you hold to the hafach, the kulaba, and everything's in it, and the Torah contains every possible thing, and again you hold to that sort of, I would say, extreme interpretation of that, then you'd have to say that, and you have to start looking in Genesis 1 for all the evidence of evolution, unless, again, you're willing to deny all the massive, overwhelming evidence for the theory of evolution, neither of which, in my opinion, are very happy or very useful or productive ways of going about things. Much better to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to quote another good Jew.
Yeah, and I completely agree. But the shortcomings I'm saying about it is, and this is something we have to grapple with, which is when people are Bari V'Shem or Bari Adif. The Gemara says, if someone says, I definitely know this, and someone says, I'm not sure, you prefer to go with the person who says, I absolutely know. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why in politics, politicians are very willing to lie and to simplify things and to tell people things which aren't true, because the general public doesn't do nuance well. Yes. Right? And they want to know, is it or isn't? Is the Torah? Mm-hmm. Is it true? Is it not true? It says the wall's 5,000. Is that true or not? Right. And they want to know, was it 6 days or was it not 6 days? Don't give me this. Tell me, was it or was it? Is it true or was it not true? And there are plenty of people out there who are able to tell you, I know it's true because the Torah is true. This is factual. It's the way it is. And they're willing to stand by it. And therefore, you've got a lot of people from the masses, if you like, which are able to say, okay, I'm willing to accept someone who stands up there and says, this is the facts, the way it is. I remember, just a really brief story, when I was in Yeshiva in Montreal, there was a professor there who was a very well-known professor in McGill University, also a Chabadnik, and I had all these questions, and the guy in Yeshiva said, go and talk to that fellow. I'm sure he knows the answer. So I went and spoke to him, and at the end, he said, you know what, all your questions are right, and I don't know the answer for it, but since the Rebbe, Lubavitch Rebbe, I bet you knew all these questions, and he didn't have a problem with it, therefore I don't have a problem. And I found that incredibly unsatisfactory, but there's this thing, he knows it, and he's the truth, and he knows the truth, and therefore that's good enough for me. That is always going to be, to a lot of people, much more compelling than the Saxion approach. So the question is, like, how can you be both honest with people and keep them engaged?
So firstly, I'd like to say another sort of similar amusing story that I had with someone, almost exactly the same conversation, where many years ago, I was presenting the difficulties between Hasidism and anti-Hasidism in the early days. And one of my friends who was a neo-Hasid getting into Hasidism was saying, no, you don't understand that there's a story about once when in yeshiva in Volozhin and Chaim Soloveitchik spent a whole hour explaining to one Talmud why Hasidism was right, and another hour explaining to him why it was wrong, and there you have the true answer. Maybe we don't know exactly how to reconcile these two positions, but and so I turned to him and I said, so let me just get this story straight. You don't have an answer to what I'm saying. Nobody has an answer to what I'm saying. you've no way of accessing this answer to anything I'm saying, but you have a story about a man who lived 150 years ago who once had an answer to what I'm saying. Is that the approach you're taking here? And that's the sort of thing. So let me, after that brief thing, let me address what you said there, which is as follows, which is, again, I think I hear your questions, and there is a certain amount of truth to the whole, like, the masses are asses kind of approach. Although I have to say that I believe that the situation nowadays, you have the internet, you have the blogosphere, you have all the books, you have all the podcasts, etc. People are better educated in certain ways. Again, not textually and not technically, but they know more, they're exposed to more, they have better access to knowledge than really, I would say, at arguably at any other point in history, first thing. And second thing is, you're talking about mass engagement here, okay? I would submit that a rabbi who gets up in shul and says, listen, science is wonderful. I love science. Science is great. And I think that the pursuit of science is something brilliant. What the scientists are doing is not only good work, but holy work and important work, and something that we should celebrate and get into. That rabbi will have the support, or at least have credibility, much more in the long term than the kind who gets up and says, scientists are stupid, they don't know what they're talking about, the world is 5,768 years old, everything else is garbage, everything else is nonsense, all the brilliant books and lectures and experts is all complete nonsense, and actually I have the truth with me. I think long-term scenario number one is simply a better, it's educationally, it's a better way of going about things. It's saying that we Jews accept science, we celebrate it, we think that the conclusions are useful and beneficial for the world, and we are optimistic about finding a way to essentially, I use the word synthesize too much. It's a different word. It's to integrate ourselves with it. Yeah. And this, just to point out, is one of the many reasons why I'm so interested in the period that I am, the 18th, 19th century, the Haskalah and the post-Haskalah, because there was, at least for many, this fundamental optimism among the early and some of the late Maskilim as well, of saying, you know what, the discoveries of the Enlightenment, the new encyclopedias and the new travel books and the new statistics and data and science and all the progress we've made is wonderful. It's good. It's positive. We Jews should accept this. We should embrace it. This should be part of our forward-thinking future. And with that, that breeds a kind of Judaism that's entirely unruffled with facing the world, with engaging the world. You say you have a new scientific discovery, bring it on. Bring it on. That's fantastic.
Which is why, just to go full circle, Louis Jacobs, right? I think he was an early pioneer of trying to do that. Maybe he was inarticulate. Maybe he wasn't mindful enough of his right flank, as Jonathan Sacks wasn't when he wrote the book, The Dignity of Difference. But people who can be articulate and artful in doing this in a way in which, as you said, can be mindful of the right flank in a way in which won't get them kicked out while they're trying to do it, is incredibly valuable. And I want to give voice to those kinds of people in this podcast with that kind of viewpoint, the one which you've just described, because I think it could be so much more inclusive. And there's so many people who would not just give it a second or third look, but would totally integrate it and live it.
Firstly, I 100% agree. I would, however, I'd say two things. The first thing is a very simple observation that is such a hackneyed cliche, it's almost not worth bothering to mention, but the notion that knowledge equals power, right? And the notion that part of the resistance to this kind of attitude is not so much the genuine belief, let's say, in the age of the universe or the descent of humankind or whatever it is, but rather the idea that external people who are not Jewish, people who are not part of the Jewish tradition, have a legitimate source of authority, right? They are a legitimate source of truth. That is very threatening to some who have banked their entire credence on the fact that only this very specific set of books has truths in them. And me, as an authoritative interpreter of this set of books, I'm a conduit of this knowledge and therefore a true exerciser of this power. That's something that's so important. Again, that's sort of the sociological and Foucauldian side of the Jewish scene, I would say, at the moment. The first thing. The second thing also I would have to say, again, just to reiterate, is the difference between something like science, age of the universe, something like that, and biblical criticism. For the simple reason that we said before of Maimonides, which is that if it had been accepted as one of, let's say, Maimonides' 13 principles or a general article of faith that the universe is a certain a certain age, or that humankind is descended into the world in a certain way, or whatever it is, that would be much more difficult, I think, to write about, to dislodge, to be optimistic about that sort of thing. The clash would be too salient, as it is with the Bible and biblical criticism. The Bible is, again, because of the, one could say, lamentable, but nonetheless, the historically undeniable acceptance of Maimonides, specifically his 8th principle on regarding the Torah, it's much more difficult to innovate in that area.
It's not about innovation. It just comes from the same kind of concept, right? Which is,
Sure.
if you believe in this concept and which you espouse as the Saxion concept, like you said,
yes,
it's given to Caesar what is Caesar's. In other words, let the people who are experts in textual analysis tell us what it is, and the same kind of approach they use. And I studied high and low criticism, but with the Talmud, for example, and it works wonderfully with the Talmud.
Yes, 100%.
And it's actually, the Talmud is designed to be able to do high and low criticism with it.
Of course, it's marvelous. For those who are listening and are not entirely sure what he's talking about, the major pioneer of this was of course, he recently died and I'm blanking on his name, Weiss Halivni.
Yeah, Halivni Weiss.
What's his first name? David Weiss. Halivni or David Weiss. So he was a real pioneer in this field of high and low criticism of the Talmud, is essentially taking a look at the Talmud and being able to break it up into its earlier and later strata. Levels of it. And of course, there's a perfectly plausible Orthodox explanation for this, which is that the Talmud is in fact a human artifact, and it
has multiple historical layers as well.
Correct.
Text earlier than later. But to be able to say, hey, I'm able to subject every other text in the universe to this, but not, and rely on some of the outcomes, but I can't do that to the Bible, that ends up to the smart, intelligent student to be a little bit of a bridge too far. So in other words, what I'm saying is that,
unless you're willing to swallow the pill that it's a divine text. But if you're willing to swallow the presupposed idea that it's a divine text, then the rules by which one ought to be able to analyze it would presumably be substantially different to analyzing every human text, which is the response of, let's say, a mainstream Orthodox Jew today.
It's interesting because you say about Maimonides. It's interesting. As everyone who listens to this podcast knows, I have a Chabad background, so I spent an inordinate amount of time studying the Lubavitcher Rebbe's teachings.
Yes.
And he asks a very interesting question.
Rather you than me, yes.
He says, why can't God come in the flesh? I'm paraphrasing him. Why can't God come in physical form? Why can't he? He said he's never heard a proper logical explanation for why a God who's all-powerful cannot come in physical form. In other words, why can't God manifest himself? If God is infinite and all-powerful, why can't he manifest himself in this camp? Why couldn't he? In other words, he can't. There's no logical reason why you can't. If God's nimnahan nimnaot, he's within him all impossibilities. And the answer, he says, is the only reason why Jews have to believe that he can't is because the Rambam says he can't. That's it. In other words, there's no logic here. There's no real reason which I can explain. Only Maimonides says he can't, therefore we have to accept it. At some point, that becomes something which is, for a lot of people, too hard to swallow, right? In other words, because something in the 12th century, we've spent a lot of time in our conversation talking about how the Moreh Nevuchim is really, it's something which, if you read it today, it's unsatisfying because it's based in the science of the 12th century and earlier. And now you're saying, well, no, you have to accept this view, not Ibn Ezra, not anybody else, but the Rambam, what he said, because of something he wrote in his early 20s, which he may or may not have regretted.
Correct.
In other words, it becomes very challenging to accept. It's that pill.
That is the pill that's difficult to accept. And the truth is that there's a way, I wouldn't say a way around this, but it's a little bit, one could imagine, in fact, Franz Rosenzweig took this position and others as well, of applying, let's say, the Saxion dichotomy also to biblical studies as well, which is, and to a certain degree, Louis Jacobs as well, adopted this position, which is that there's a world of a difference between believing that the Bible is divine and that the specific way in which it came about to be is the way that it's described, let's say, by Maimonides and by the rabbinic text. In other words, there wasn't a contradiction for Louis Jacobs between saying something like the Torah is divine. However, it was in fact cobbled together by various authors throughout several centuries and eventually redacted and edited sometime around the time of the first exile. And again, that also again splits the question of, the ultimate validity of something and the precise manner in which it came about to be, like we've been talking about Age of the Universe or Theory of Evolution or something like that. Correct. Now, the truth, again, But this again brings us full circle to the book review I wrote at the beginning. One could imagine a Jewish Orthodoxy that would be able to say this, that would be able to say, we accept the divinity of the Torah without subscribing to any specific manner in which it came to be, any specific narrative of how it developed. Okay? One could imagine that. My argument in that book review, and which I stand by, is that is not the way the Orthodoxy has developed over the last few centuries, and therefore the vast portion of Orthodox, both individuals and authorities, would not be able to accept a Jacobsian view because they've accepted not only the divinity of the Torah, but also a specific narrative of how it came into existence.
But all those people who are not accepting that, I would argue, they're not accepting that the world was billions of years old either, and they're not accepting it. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that's why I'm very sympathetic to the kind of view which says that I'm not having them tell me, what is orthodoxy and what isn't. I understand that's what they want to put it in as in their guarded as being, but these are people who think that when the Gemara talks about the sun going out of a window and going back over and the world might be flat.
But none of those are articles of faith or ever became articles of faith. See, again, I'm arguing from historical development. Historically, Orthodoxy developed along certain lines. It did not treat the science of the Talmud as an article of faith. It did treat the giving of the Torah to Moses as an article of faith, rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly. One could argue this until the cows come home. It doesn't matter. It's the way it is. If you want to play the game, that's the game you have to play.
And you have to give lip service to that no matter what.
No matter what. It's analogous
to you have to internally believe it somehow. In other words, what is your argument here? Because if you're the kind of person who has your eyes wide open, right, just like you do when you're studying evolution and astrophysics and physics, etc., and you're using a Saxion approach, so that's the way you're taking it, and you take that also
for argument's sake. I'm not saying that I adopt that in all cases and all circumstances, but let's follow your hypothetical.
So let's say you're doing that, right, and now you say, here you got to stop. Does that mean now that you're actually changing as a person? You're willing to accept that you're no longer taking the Saxion approach, or you're just giving lip service to not doing it for the areas which are...
So I would say there are a few possible ways of trying to get out of that. Because I agree. Your question is a good one, which is that you can't selectively decide to follow the science and then selectively not. You can't cherry pick.
Yeah,
and that's
authentically.
So there are a few different responses now. One of them is to say that biblical criticism simply isn't a science. I can accept astrophysics. I can accept biology. These things, I have hard evidence. I have a fossil in my hand which says something. Biblical criticism. Now, the truth is, as I said before, this is a tenuous argument on both sides. There isn't a consensus about the extent to which biblical criticism has standards of evidence, has any material articles to back it up.
But it's an old argument. It's all. I've got a PhD in psychology, and a lot of the hard science people say that psychology is not a hard science as well.
Right.
And I completely disagree.
Fair enough, but I'm saying it is at least. And I'd phrase this carefully, especially because I don't want to get into trouble with some of my colleagues in the Bible studies department. But I think it's beyond doubt that one could make a reasonable intellectual case, let's say. And especially because, and this is also important to note, that within the departments of biblical studies, there are so many different, divergent, and contradictory theories of exactly how the documentary hypothesis is supposed to look and exactly how the books came to be. And there's the supplementary hypothesis, and there's the fragmentary hypothesis, and the documentary hypothesis, and there's various versions of many of these hypotheses and exactly when they were written, by whom, and how they came into being. That it doesn't constitute the kind of science that one would need to throw out, that one would need to, let's say, throw out one's own intellectual honesty for, right? Well, just say, okay, so you have a discipline here, but okay, so a discipline is nice, but actually, if I don't agree with the foundations of the discipline, if I just don't think the discipline's valid, if I don't think standards of evidence are rigorous enough, then I could actually choose not to follow it. Unlike, let's say, physics or biology, okay? So that's one possible argument to make. Another possible argument you could say is something along the lines of, I will follow the science wherever it leads, apart from a very small list of tripwires, okay? And the truth is that this is not, again, this sounds cherry-picking, this sounds intellectually dishonest, and to a certain degree it is. However, it seems to me that both religious and irreligious people do have these guardrails they're not willing to traverse. So let me give you an example of religious people. So let's say there can somehow be brought some sort of evidence I don't know, against the existence of God or something like that, right? A hard piece of evidence.
Yeah.
A religious person could turn around and say, listen, I'm willing to follow science on the vast majority of everything. However, there are a few axioms of my worldview that I'm simply unwilling to follow you on, even if the evidence would be overwhelming, because the personal, let's say, experiential evidence that I have in my own heart of the truth of God's existence will always and forever overwhelm any kind of external evidence you could ever present to me. Okay, I'm not advocating this approach, I want to be clear, but I am saying that there can be a level of intellectual respectability in this. And I have to say, I've observed, and I know you want to come back, but let me just get on this. I have observed within the academic world, there are certain things, especially in today's university settings, you're not allowed to say or really entertain. Okay, and I'll give you a very simple example: IQ and race. Okay, this is something where if you are a researcher, it is almost impossible to get any funding or any journal to print or anything concerning the question of IQ differentials among racial groups.
Larry Summers got into big trouble, if you remember, at Harvard.
Huge trouble just for mentioning the possibility of, I can't even remember the exact.
To do with women and
to do with women, exactly. But again, you could imagine a researcher turning around to you and say, listen, I'm interested in researching science. I want to follow where the evidence leads. However, for me, being an anti-racist and being someone who stands up against discrimination is so strong that it's such a fundamental part of who I am as a human being. It is a sort of a platform, a foundation of my moral worldview, that I'm unwilling to go down the garden path of, let's say, researching IQ and race, or even reading the research of IQ and race, because it might give credence to discrimination against certain people of certain races based on, let's say, the possibility they may have in general lower IQ, which again is disputed in the science, but whatever. So the question of always following science and research to wherever it goes, no matter damn the consequences, I don't know. I don't know who practices that, but maybe no one, you know?
No, and I think you're absolutely right. And everyone has their, I remember finding this in academia, both in the Jewish Studies department where I studied in University College London, and also in psychology, that scientists have their no-go areas. I remember a very celebrated scholar in psychology, and I remember talking to him about determinism. Self-determination theory was his field, where, for it to work, you have to believe that people have a sense of agency.
Right.
Now, if you're a determinist, it just doesn't work.
Of course not.
I remember myself and a colleague trying to argue determinism with him, and it was like arguing atheism with a rabbi. It was just like there was such a strong reaction to it that he was incredibly dogmatic about the fact that everyone has agency. Yeah. And so this exists everywhere. And there are people who, if it's going to destroy their work, their life's work, they're just not going there.
Incidentally,
and they will fight everything at you, to be honest. So
I was going to say, I 100% agree. I was going to say, incidentally, I actually think that the question of human agency is one of the last fields in which there is serious philosophical and scientific and religious debate, and the jury's not out in any of them. In other words, both among religious traditions.
You mean
Jury, not Jewry.
The jury is not out, meaning, in other words,
meaning there are some philosophers who will defend human agency and some philosophers who will defend determinism. There are some neuroscientists and physicists and neurologists who will defend human agency and some who will not. And there are some religious people, I would say the vast majority, and certainly within the Jewish tradition, who will defend human agency. But there are a minority who will make some space for there being some kind of deterministic worldview as well, following people like the Ishbitzer Rebbe and others. So, and I think actually this is an underrated and perhaps underutilized field of fascinating debate. And what's interesting to me is that we're still waiting for results in this. In other words, there's still various experiments and brain imaging and just an understanding of the brain and the possibility of human agency, the possibility of some sort of ghost in the machine. This could well be this should be, and I think is, a frontier of scientific philosophy, religious debate and discourse, which can be very fruitful, but it's still developing in front of our eyes.
Yeah. And to go back to the Sadducees who believed in determinism versus the Pharisees who believed in some kind of limited agency. Anyway, this has been such a fantastic conversation, JJ. Really appreciate. Yeah, so did I. And I hope that the audience listening to it will also.
To be honest, there's so much more to say on all of these topics that I'd be happy to do part 2.0 in the future. These are very rich questions, and I would only hope that more Jews and more talented podcast hosts like yourself would take these questions on and discuss them seriously.
The only thing I would say is that I think the audience for it is limited, which is I don't think we end up getting a massive following, but I think for the people who do care about this, incredibly valuable, and I do it for those people and myself as well, because I really enjoy it, as you can tell.
So 100%. Me too.
Really grateful. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.